Former top official at the State Department under President Barack Obama is blaming President Trump's foreign policies for violent protests that targeted the U.S. Embassy in Iraq. And protesters withdrew the following day and are now calling on the country's parliament to push for a U.S. withdrawal from Iraq.
And the Trump administration has blamed Iran for the attacks. And as we said, late last night, an airstrike by the U.S. forces killed the head of Iran's elite Quds force. The Department of Defense says he was actively developing plans to attack American diplomats. So here to weigh in on all of this, the presidential candidate's reactions, is Aaron Maté. He's host of Pushback with Aaron Maté. He joins us now via Skype. It's great to see you, Aaron.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Aaron, I mean, first of all, just can you give us just a sense of what the general candidate's reaction has been to this? I know most of them have weighed in at this point, and then some of your own analysis as well, and how you see this shaking out in terms of our national discourse.
I should declare my partisan bias here. We're talking about the candidates, so I support Bernie Sanders. And I was heartened to see his response, which was unequivocal in condemning this attack and warning about the consequences. Tulsi Gabbard, who I think has also been very strong when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, I haven't seen her reaction yet, but I'm expecting much of the same. Compare that to the other major candidates. You have Joe Biden with a very convoluted statement criticizing Trump sort of on process grounds, saying, wondering whether Trump has a plan now that he's done this, and warning of potential consequences, but not really an outright condemnation. And that fits in with a long, I think, centrist democratic foreign policy tradition of sharing with neocons and hawks in Washington similar foreign policy goals, and only coming out with criticisms when it comes to narrow technical issues like tactics and strategy. It reminds me of when John Kerry, when he ran against George W. Bush in 2004, on the campaign trail, his main critique of Bush when it comes to Iraq was that Bush didn't have a plan to win the peace after launching the war. And of course, it was hard for Kerry to criticize Bush on the Iraq war because Kerry, like Joe Biden, voted for that war. And it's similar now. They don't have the strong principled position to take because they actually share the principles of the hawks in Washington, who Trump is acting on behalf of. I think you can say a similar critique for Elizabeth Warren, sort of a process critique. And also,
we have her tweet. We can actually put that up while you talk about it. She says Soleimani was a murderer responsible for the deaths of thousands, including hundreds of Americans. But this reckless move escalates the situation with Iran, increases the likelihood of more deaths and new Middle East conflict. Our priority must be to avoid another costly war. So leading with the he's a bad dude, and then a sort of mild critique of what's been done here.
Yeah, so, accepting the underlying argument of the Trump administration that this was an evil person with blood on his hands who then deserved to be targeted, although Warren is saying that maybe we shouldn't have done this now. I think that's the implication of her critique. So let's address what she says there about Soleimani having blood on his hands, because it's important to address. Look, when American politicians like Warren talk about Soleimani having blood on his hands, they're referring primarily to the fact that Soleimani was the head of the IRGC, which was responsible for the deaths of American soldiers in Iraq. Well, who bears ultimate responsibility for that? I don't think it's Iran, who, after especially their experience in the 1980s, when the Reagan administration was supporting Saddam Hussein in his murderous war against Iran, that killed hundreds of thousands of Iranians. I think Iran had rightful grounds to be concerned about having a foreign enemy inside Iraq. And so they intervened there. I think that was a rational choice. Whether, I'm not defending certain policy decisions, but I think that was the plausible reaction to the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq. And it's the Bush administration and the Democrats who supported that invasion who really have the blood on their hands of both the Iraqis and the Americans who were killed. Soleimani also helped defend Iran from ISIS. And that is why inside Iran, Soleimani is seen as a hero. He's actually, according to a U.S.-backed poll, he is seen as Iran's most popular figure. Now, the IRGC, which Soleimani was the head of, he was the head of the Quds Force, which is their foreign wing. Inside Iran, the IRGC is certainly very oppressive and a threat to Iranians. I think we should be very clear about that. But Soleimani himself personally maintained a popular figure because he was responsible for the IRGC's external roles.
Right.
And that external role, part of it really literally entailed defeating ISIS. And if not for what Soleimani did, ISIS very well could have been in control inside Iraq and also inside Syria. And we hear none of that from U.S. politicians because Iran stood in the way of U.S. hegemony in places like Iraq and Syria.
I think it's an important point. I think the point that needs to be made, too, is like, and you're right, which is that nobody empowered Iran. Nobody gave them the opportunity more to, become a bigger enemy of the United States than the people who invaded Iraq. I mean, they are the ones who created the strategic space in order for them to operate. I mean, I would push back a little bit. I do think, he was a major enemy of the U.S. and IRGC involvement in the war against ISIS, sure, mostly because they want to maintain a client state there in Syria. But I think, Aaron, what we want to get at here is, where do you think things will go from here? Is this for sure a escalatory move? Is there any possibility of de-escalation from Iran? That's something we've been tracking here very closely.
Well, look, the U.S. is the global mafia don. And so Iran's options, I think, are actually limited. There is fear now of war, and I think that's a very fair fear. But Iran, unless it wants to get destroyed, actually does have limited options. What it could do is further weaken the U.S. inside Iraq, especially, and try to use this to get the U.S. And its forces to leave Iraq. And I think in that respect, Trump has actually boosted Iran's hand here. And I think you'll see steps towards that. And you'll probably see, in terms of escalation, lower grade escalation. Iran has allies and proxies around the Middle East. And so we could see stepped up attacks against the U.S. and its allies there. But in terms of a full-scale war, that's not what I'm concerned about. It's more just a slow creeping series of escalatory steps by both sides, which, by the way, is exactly what the neocons in Washington wanted from the start. That's why Trump tore up the Iran nuclear deal, which was working totally fine. It was constraining the prospects of an Iranian nuclear program, which at the time never even actually existed. It was constraining their prospects. It was leading to diplomatic engagement. And the neocons in Washington didn't want that because Iran acts as a counter to U.S. hegemony, U.S. and Israeli and Saudi hegemony in the region. And that's why people in Washington, whether they're in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, want to weaken Iran. And it's not having Democratic candidates to push back on that, except for Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard, is very dangerous. And speaking of Democrats, I'll just say also that it's one of the many reasons why some of us on the left were so against this hyper-focus on conspiracy theories about Vladimir Putin controlling Russia, controlling Trump. Because as all this was happening and all the speculation about Russia was happening, Trump has been pursuing this agenda from the start. He tore up the Iran nuclear deal. He imposed these murderous sanctions on Iran that have prevented Iran from importing food and medicine, that have caused massive suffering. So this is the outcome that all this was always heading to. And a failure to have a proper democratic opposition to stand up to this, to try to stop the Trump administration's push to war in Iran, has helped bring us here.
I mean, it says it all. That while on the one hand, Democratic leadership is saying he's lawless, we've got to impeach him, they fixated on this. On the other hand, they're handing him another NDAA where he has unchecked powers to do exactly what he just did.
Right.
Aaron, always great to have your perspective.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Next on Rising, one organization's mission is to take so-called Trump country back from the president.
And they want to put it in the hands of the progressives like Senator Bernie Sanders, our Revolution's executive director. He shares how they're planning to do that, and that's next.